Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be discussing a national context that we haven't covered so much on the show yet, and that is Canada. And my guest today is Dr. Tamara Small. She is an associate professor in political science at the University of Guelph. And Dr. Small has been doing research on the impact of the internet and social media on the Canadian political space since the early 2000s. And she has a new book out, an edited volume co-edited with Harold Jensen, entitled Digital Politics in Canada: Promises and Realities. And so while the book is focused particularly on empirical Canadian cases, it does so with a broad theoretical brush, and it looks at a variety of ways that digital is shaping Canadian politics by looking at the practices of politicians, journalists, e-government initiatives at the institutional level, but also at the mass communication level, looking at practices of democratic citizenship online and also social movements. So really a broad take on how digital is shaping politics, and that's kind of in the spirit that we're going to move into this episode and focus really on the breadth of Dr. Small's work rather than dive into the nitty-gritty of just one or two studies. And that's really nice because that breadth covers so many political actors. We're going to talk about political parties' use of social media in Canada over time and kind of what structural elements might influence those practices. We'll also look into memes shared about Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, and then move into something that we really haven't talked about on the podcast before because there isn't so much research out there on this in Canada or otherwise, and that is the use of social media by judiciary courts and journalists live tweeting about court cases, which is interesting because courts often have this notion of open courts. Courts should be accessible and open to the public and visible and transparent. And so how are Canadian courts actually using social media can give us some insight into whether digital is helping promote the open court principle. So I'm excited to get into that aspect of the judiciary branch and also the political context of Canada. And as ever, the link to the book and all the studies we discuss will be down in the episode description. I think there's maybe 6 or 7 different studies that we touch on. So I'm not going to read all the titles here, but you can find them down in the show notes. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Tamara Small. Again, she is an associate professor in political science at the University of Guelph. Dr. Small, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we dive into your recent research on social media and the Canadian courts, why don't we talk a little bit about your latest edited volume, Digital Politics in Canada? As you note in the introduction, there hasn't been so much research on the Canadian digital space, even though Canadians were early and widespread adopters of digital tech. So first, why do you think that is, and how did the book aim to fill this research gap?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I would characterize it that we don't have a ton of research, but it's more that we don't have a community of scholars in the digital space, either in political communication or sort of more broadly in sort of digital politics or even like sort of internet research. And so this research is probably happening, but it's happening within individual silos such as public administration, political science, sociology, communication studies, and we're not really talking to one another, even though I think a lot of this work probably touches on the political space. And so what Harold Jensen and I wanted to do with this book is to bring together a number of scholars who we were sort of aware of their work in various fields and bring them together and ask them to answer the same questions sort of vis-a-vis digital technology in Canada. And this idea that it's been 20 years since we've been sort of thinking about this technology and scholars have been looking at this technology, and we really hadn't had a sort of sustained look at it. And so we had the great opportunity of bringing together some amazing scholars across the country, studying various aspects of this topic. And I think one of the great things about the book is that if you read each individual chapter, I think you get a very sort of rich understanding of that individual topic. But I think if you read the book from cover to cover, I think what the book allows someone to do is to sort of see how various structures, institutions in Canada might mediate how digital technology and social media operates in the political space. And I think that that's sort of one of the things I'm most proud about the book is this sort of sustained look across the entire political system rather than in a single technology.
Yeah, it really covers a wide range of institutional actors, but then also the kind of activity from below, in terms of citizens, which is often left out in this type of research. But your chapter specifically focuses on political parties' digital campaigning, which is something that you've been working on since the early 2000s. So I wanted to ask, overall, what does the development of Canadian parties' use of social media look like over time? And I ask it that way because on the one hand, there are some similarities to the US in terms of, being in North America and having a good digital infrastructure. But on the other hand, Canada is a multi-party system, which makes it more like these European styles of governance. So I'm curious to hear how you think those, specific Canadian structures relative to the US might have affected that digital campaigning over time.
Yeah, I think as you rightly point out, context matters here. I think being so close to the United States, we are sort of inundated with information about the digital campaign and technology in the United States. And I think there's an expectation that Canadian politics is going to look very similar, but it doesn't look very similar. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one is sort of our elections and our election law. So our campaigns are very short compared to American elections. They're between 36 to 50 days, which means that it's a very concentrated time for parties and candidates to try to communicate with citizens. Our campaign finance rules are quite strict. Limited amounts of money can be spent and spent in particular areas, which means that the need to fundraise is not as strong as the United States. And also, the amount of money that is needed to run a campaign is nowhere near the amount of money that an American politician would need. I think also, the idea that we have a party system, that parties are really important, matters as opposed to a candidate based system. So, you don't have individual candidates, even though we do have candidates running in local ridings. It is really the party that is driving and the party leader that is driving the campaign. And as such, the need for individual candidates to reach out to voters through technology is quite limited. And again, I think where we're different from Europe, we have a single member plurality system, which means that it's only small numbers of votes that get you over the top. And so there still is this focus in on individual ridings at the national level to win the vote. And I think the final thing I would say is, and this is more of a technology reason than a political reason, that political Twitter is not as strong as it is in the United States. We don't have this sort of Twitterati at a lot of people in that space tweeting about politics. And so while Twitter is important to the parties and to journalists, I don't think it inspires Canadians to the same extent that political Twitter might in the United States.
Yeah, and I think that would be something that's shared, especially in Europe as well, this kind of low level of Twitter use among most people, right? They have the journalists and the elites that use it. But it does make me wonder about, it seems that, and I'm very cautious about focusing too much on the US, which is kind of what the literature does anyways. But it would seem that Canada and the US be really good cases to compare against one another, particularly for these reasons, like a long campaign versus a short campaign. But that just doesn't seem to be happening so much.
Yeah, I think if you're any sort of good Canadian political scientist is always sort of weary of the American Canadian comparison because the institutions are just so different. But I think your point about comparison and to the point about Canadian research earlier is that Canada is not actually included in much of the comparative cases that you see elsewhere, where I think it actually would be valuable. So we don't see comparisons with the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and even some of the other European countries in which I think Canada would be an interesting comparative case. Because they do bring something a little bit slightly different to the table, but there is some similarities. And so, again, to the point about why we don't see a ton of Canadian research, or it doesn't seem this way, I think is also that we're outside of the sort of comparative, people's thinking about when we think about comparative cases, we should include Canada as part of that.
definitely. But I have to make one comparison as an American, which is we tend to think of Canadians as more polite than Americans. And I think that holds true, especially in the political discourse, where it's hard to get more vitriolic than the US these days. And so I wanted to ask you about a study you conducted on Canadian party leaders' tweets in the 2011 elections, looking at the level of negativity that they were using on Twitter, and found that only around 1 in 10 tweets were negative. And so I wanted to ask, do you think that's something that might be an artifact of being a sort of earlier case in social media use, and that has sort of changed over time as maybe Canadians have looked to see how politicians in other countries have had success using social media to spread extreme messages? Or do you think there's something in the Canadian political culture that makes political leaders more polite online?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, negativity is part of Canadian campaigns, like it is elsewhere. Why Twitter is so sort of positive is an interesting question. So I did do a little looking around the last couple of days just to sort of think about this. And, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, our leader of the opposition, Aaron O'Toole, I went down, scrolled down many, many tweets with no mention of each other.
Mm.
Our third party leader, Jagmeet Singh, he was more likely to have to refer to the other leaders, and perhaps if I was to code it, probably would code it more negatively. But Twitter for the main two parties is a promotion tool. Like, this is what we use it for. And again, to the point made earlier, I do wonder if it's about who's out there. And I think who's out there are journalists. What they're trying to do is shape the message. Like, that's what I think Canadian parties see Twitter as a way to communicate their message to other sort of elites who are going to shape the message. And they're not necessarily speaking directly to Canadians or even to their supporters. And so therefore, if I was to hypothesize a reason why we see this sort of very positive Twitter space for parties, is because Twitter is really about sort of shaping the message for journalists.
Mm. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's interesting that, as you were saying before, with the majority of the populace not there, then maybe there isn't, that appetite for it. So that kind of traditional route to journalists would make sense. So I wanted to ask you about a recent study you conducted on memes about Justin Trudeau, where you have citizens generating content, and there it wasn't quite so positive, right? So could you describe that study for us in terms of what memes you looked at and how you went about classifying them?
Yeah, so this study that you're talking about is a study about our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, but it's the second study that we looked at where we looked at memes of a Canadian Prime Minister. So our first one was on Stephen Harper earlier a couple of years ago, and then this recent one that we did in Justin Trudeau. And so what we looked at were what we call image macro memes, which is the one where you have an image, you have some text on the top, and sort of the punchline at the bottom. And when we analyzed the memes, we were looking at the sort of the focus, the topic, and the tone. And what was interesting is sort of the difference between the two studies, I think. For us and my colleague Marie Lalacente, the main sort of conclusion for both studies was that these are tools sort of to oppose or critique the leader. Denunciation is the main goal. But with the Stephen Harper study, it was very much focused on politics. What people didn't like about Stephen Harper was his politics. Justin Trudeau was very different. What people didn't like about Justin Trudeau and used memes to talk about was his personality. So the critique was about who he was rather than what he did. Where Stephen Harper, despite the fact that I don't think Stephen Harper was wildly popular, I think it was about what he did rather than who he was. And so we sort of speculate at the end of the paper that this is probably related to actually the way that both Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper present themselves. Stephen Harper very much presented himself around his policy. Personality was not very particularly important. And so people focused in on that, where Justin Trudeau, an important part of the Justin Trudeau brand is Justin Trudeau outside of sort of the politics. And I think people were reacting to that. But I think the last sort of thing that I found really interesting was, regardless of all of that, these memes were really political. These were made by people who understood the politics of the day, understood political issues. And when they made their memes, they were making very conscious decisions about what memes to choose from the meme universe, but also like the political content by which they also wanted to critique. So they were not just sort of, we don't like Justin Trudeau for random reasons. We don't like Justin Trudeau because he's these things that are very specific to what is happening in our politics. And so we definitely sort of conclude that they are a part of political participation and a political critique of leadership.
That's interesting. This difference between Trudeau and Harper, because I don't know so much about Stephen Harper, but I mean, Justin Trudeau, obviously, he does have this kind of celebrity about him. And I think, as far as I know, he tries to cultivate that with, professional photographers for his social media accounts. And he's seen as quite social media savvy. So do you think that plays into it? Like the more celebrity or personality that a candidate might put into their image would make them more susceptible, I guess, to being memeified.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that these meme makers or these people, whoever these people are reacting to sort of the politics that is being presented to them. It's funny because Stephen Harper was the first prime minister to have a person follow him around with a camera, and actually he was very, very image focused. But his sort of the way he sort of presented himself was very much about politics. And I think, as you rightly point out, Justin Trudeau, Rolling Stone, Vogue covers, it's really important part of his politics and the way and his branding. And I think that people are very much reacting to that. And I think that, it would be an interesting hypothesis to take another leader and to see whether or not this was sort of a uniquely specific response to the Justin Trudeau brand, or whether or not maybe it's just moving towards a more personalization. But I think that because Justin Trudeau presented himself in this particular way, the memes were reacting to him in this particular way.
Yeah, I want to transition over into the Canadian justice system, which I think is a really interesting topic to focus on, that judicial branch of government that's often left out of social media communication. But it is an important part of politics that can be presented to the public through social media. So you looked at whether social media was extending or fulfilling this idea of the open court principle. And so I'm wondering if you could explain what that is before we move into some more of the empirical work.
Yeah, so this project is, the papers that we're going to talk about are part of a broader project that I've been working on with my colleague Kate Puttiser at the University of Guelph. And these 4 papers are very much probably the most interdisciplinary work that I've ever done, in part because I actually don't know a lot about the Canadian legal system. It's not sort of an area that I had ever done research in. But a conversation with Dr. Puttister, who is a legal scholar in our department, I had sort of said to her one day, talking about a particular, like live tweeting of a particular trial, that it would be really interesting to look at this. And she's like, well, the way that you would do it is through this idea of the open court, something that I didn't know about. And once she had explained it to me, I was like, yeah, this is an important lens. And so the open court principle is the idea that courts should be open both physically and metaphorically to litigants and the public. So the idea is that justice must be seen to be done. And so justice must be transparent. It should allow for participation. And those two things should allow for the accountability of the justice system. And so the main sort of way that the open court principle had been actualized, I guess there's 2 ways, would be the idea that people could go to courts and sit in them and see that, but also that the mainstream media would be the venue by which the courts would transmit what they do to citizens. And while there's not a huge literature in Canada or elsewhere on this topic, there was a lot of people speculating about how digital technologies and social media could impact that or change that. That one of the ways would be that it would allow courts to sort of bypass the mainstream media, so make that relationship more direct between citizens and the court system and the legal system, but also to sort of allow different ways of information to be able to be transmitted from the courts to citizens, even through journalism. And so again, there's sort of similar claims that we see in other parts of the literature about openness and transparency, but this principle of the open court is actually a longstanding principle that is sort of, in some ways, part of the Canadian justice system.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking, we often talk about politicians circumventing the media, right, to get their messages directly to the public. And I guess that would also apply to courts, because I can imagine that when a court release or a trial is filtered through the media, it might take on a more sensationalist or kind of attention grabbing focus that maybe the courts don't necessarily want to have themselves. So it could provide a nice opportunity there.
Yeah, and so one part of the open court principle is this idea of public education, right? So for people to have confidence in the courts, they need to understand what courts do. And if we're focusing on, as you say, sensational trials, it sort of doesn't give the full sort of scope of what the legal system actually does. And one of the trials that we looked at, the Ghomeshi trial, this was a very sensational trial. And one of the things that we sort of outside of sort of digital technology was sort of the sense that it wasn't clear that Canadians really understood how the justice system worked because they were quite upset by various things happening in the trial. That I think if you have a sort of clearer understanding of the justice system, you'd be like, well, I don't really like this, but I understand how the institution works. And so the idea here would be that technology could allow courts to engage in that public education themselves.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about the courts first because you had done some work on that, but we're talking a bit about the journalists live tweeting and the court cases. So maybe we could stick on that, which is interesting. I mean, the concept of live tweeting obviously is sort of putting a lot of tweets in succession, reporting about something as it's happening. And in that case, then the journalist is essentially passing on that information to the public, but in this live tweeting sort of way. So you looked at two high-profile cases where journalists were live tweeting about those cases. And so can you give us a bit of context into those cases and what you were trying to basically categorize the different tweets into to see whether it lived up to this open court principle?
Yeah, so we began with this Ghomeshi trial. So this was an extremely, extremely important trial a couple of years ago. For those of you who don't know, John Ghomeshi was a pop star who became a journalist and had a very, very popular radio program for very many, many years. And then all of these sort of allegations of sexual assault came out. So this was a trial that had a lot of attention and it was being discussed a lot on Twitter. And there was a ton of articles, newspaper articles coming out about whether or not this was good or bad and all this kind of stuff. And so this was the sort of point where I was like, oh, this would be something interesting to tap into. And so my colleague Kate Putterster and I decided to take that trial. Then we decided to take another trial, which was a pretty sensational trial. It was a murder trial that included some grandparents and their granddaughter, but it was from a different province. And so it got a bit of attention. It was a sensational trial, but didn't have the kind of celebrity that Ghomeshi had. And so the idea that we chose these two trials was to have high-level crimes, but the Ghomeshi trial might just be an outlier because of the nature of that particular trial. And so what we wanted to do with the paper was to test some of these sort of hypotheses that we found in the literature about how live tweeting could increase engagement with citizens. And so we created a coding scheme that allowed us to get at what journalists were doing and what potentially they could do that would open up the court. So are they providing more information? Are they engaging in editorializing? So one of the big criticisms about live tweeting would be that normally journalists have editors who would edit out some of that stuff. And because they were live tweeting in the moment, if they were editorializing or making mistakes or providing opinion, that stuff wouldn't be taken out. And so we created a coding scheme that attempted to get at the various ways that we thought potentially journalists might engage in live tweeting.
And I'm thinking about, this is interesting, this idea of being disassociated from editors, because I think when journalists are there in their home turf of Twitter, maybe there is a incentive to kind of build their own following. And I don't know how much this applies to these particular journalists, but I think that, for a lot of journalists, the amount of Twitter followers they have is important for them in kind of climbing up to higher news organizations or something like that. So I think there is definitely a risk that journalists would maybe, without editorial oversight, steer more towards growing their own followings as well.
Right. And I think that would then lead to a particular type of tweeting about their trial potentially that would look very different than what they might write in a newspaper article. And so we've seen work in American politics looking at journalists that talks about this very different thing, that, when journalists tweet about elections, there's a little bit more snark because, again, you want to say the thing, but you also want people to think it's interesting. And so the way your tone, your approach might be very different than, your sort of standard article. So there's a potential that these tweets could look very different than what we're used to journalists doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And through that analysis, you basically provide some mixed evidence, I think, about the potential for live tweeting to increase public access to the court. So could you describe those findings for us in terms of what seemed promising and perhaps not so promising for the public's access to justice?
Yeah, so what we found, so journalists were there, they were live tweeting. But what we really found, I'm going to use a sporting analogy, was that journalists were play by play broadcasters as opposed to color commentary. So in sports, you usually have two people. One is the play by play person who's telling you what's happening in the moment. And then you have the color commentator who's providing sort of background information, interesting stats, this sort of thing. And what we found was journalists mainly were these play by play. They were writing thousands of tweets verbatim of what happened. So this is what just happened. This is what this person just said. This is what they just showed. This is what the judge said. Just tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet. And the amount of sort of extra content that, either valuable or not valuable was actually quite minimal. And one of the sort of interesting things for us was that, sort of methodological sort of finding that we had, which was we had purposely decided not to random sample the tweets based on a pretest. And this was turned out to probably to be the best decision that we ever made, because had we had random sampled the tweets, we would have no idea what was happening, because the tweets would be completely decontextualized because they actually depend on the tweet that came before it. So as you're coding, you actually need to know what the previous tweet was. And so I think if we would have random sampled, I don't think that this study would have had pretty much any value, because I think so our purposive sample, which we sampled by day, coded all the tweets in a single day, was able for us to really see how journalists were approaching them. So in some ways, they were kind of, court stenographers. So if you were a person who was super interested in the trial, then you would get all the sort of detail that you wanted. But it would not be very valuable for someone who was sort of coming in and out of the trial, because if you just sort of, went to the live feed in the middle of it, you would just be like, okay, so we're looking at evidence 2.4. I don't know what that is without the other tweet, right? So it was a bit of an interesting finding that how sort of verbatim court stenographers that they were, but they produced thousands of tweets over. You can just imagine these people are there every day for 21 days, and then just hammering out minute by minute, second by second, what this person just said with very little greater context.
Yeah, it makes me think about what we were talking about earlier about the sort of audience of Twitter in Canada, where maybe, like you were saying with some of the politicians, there isn't so much negativity or sensationalism. So I wonder who do you think the audience would be for those type of tweets? I mean, do you think it might be just to kind of inform other outlets of what's going on, or maybe there just isn't a sort of demand for that sort of sensationalist content where everyone gets swept up in a trial? I think it's interesting that they were just kind of bullet pointing out the processes of the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on. I'm not too sure that there was any real sort of, I think it was just this big trial came, people were going to live tweet it, and they were talking about Twitter. And I'm not really, I don't get a sense from this that there was any kind of strategy towards. And so we had spoken to a brief conversation that we had with a journalist who started out in the first day and decided not to live tweet. And this, this is not in the paper, but in the email she had said to us that she just didn't think it was particularly valuable. So she attended the trial, but she did like longer blogs later on because she thought she could do something. And so I think these people just got swept up in the moment, and this is how they sort of approached it. And I think also their media organizations wanted to say that they were live tweeting it. So most of these, you could find these right through, like there was like a page around it, and these live tweets were sort of streaming through them. I mean, I think that the legal community might be interested in these things. So law professors, law students, I think they're sort of interested in this. But this idea of public education, I think, is probably very minimal. And the other thing I would say about this, to this idea of the open court, was that most of these courts and the cases that we looked at, it was only journalists that were able to live tweet. That most of the courts in Canada, not all of them, but most of them, do not allow anyone who is not a journalist to engage in this practice. And so despite the fact that technology could allow a citizen, even a law professor for that matter, to engage in this live tweeting, we find that the rules actually are quite closed and sort of maintain this traditional, the media is sort of the vehicle by which the open court principle is maintained.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And now I want to get to what I'm super interested in, which is the courts themselves and how they are tweeting, because I just have this kind of idea of courts being these, stuffy, shadowy almost institutions. But we've been talking about this open court principle. So you looked at the tweets from 20 courts in the first half of 2019. And in conducting that research, you developed a coding scheme to kind of reflect these key components of the open court principle. I was wondering if you could outline that scheme for us as kind of an example, maybe for some of the students listening, about how you take a principle, such as the open courts, and actually put that into a way that can be analyzed by looking at these courts' tweets.
Yeah, I'll say Kate, she sort of divided the open court principle into three principles. So transparency, participation, and accountability. And when we thought about coding this, we went to the e-government literature because we're looking at the public administration side or the court administration side of the courts. Again, we don't think of the courts as sort of administrative units, but this component, these feeds, are part of the court administration. And so we looked to the e-government literature and we found a framework by a scholar named Inez Murgo, who has a number of sort of things that people could look at. And what we attempted to do was marry those principles of participation, transparency, and accountability to her framework and then come up with sort of idealized tweets, right? So an information tweet would embody transparency, an interactive tweet would embody participation, and a responsive tweet would embody accountability. And so then we went through and looked at all of the tweets that we found from all of these 20 courts Twitter feeds to see what we could find.
Yeah, and before we get into those findings, I think if I have it right, just thinking about the activity of the live journalists and the courts, it was almost that like the live journalist in these couple weeks of covering a trial tweeted more than these courts in general, right?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think one of the interesting things of this process was to sort of see how far back the court system is vis-a-vis digital technologies and social media, and not just the Twitter feeds. Like even if you go to some of the websites of some of these courts, like they're shocking in their like 1995 ness. So yes, there's all of these Twitter feeds. We found a bunch that weren't being used, but overall we found that some courts tweeted a lot, but there was lots of courts that didn't tweet very much. And so the average number of tweets per day of all of these was one. And so not a ton of content being produced, despite the fact that these courts actually do quite a lot of things on a regular basis.
And so, okay, even if we're working with maybe one tweet a day, what did they tend to be? Were they informative, interactive, or participative?
So overwhelmingly, they were informative. So again, we're not particularly critical in this idea that if you only do one of these things, you're terrible, and if you do all three of them, that you're better. But the idea is, so, because transparency is an important part of the open court principle. And so the vast majority of, I think in the high 70s, was that they were informational, that they were embodying transparency. They were telling people what the courts do and providing information. So releasing judgments and providing links to those judgments. So in real time, a court case, the Supreme Court would releasing a statement and they would provide it, letting people know about what was on the docket for that day. And then also sort of information about like what's happening at the court physically. It's being closed today. There's problems with weather. If you have to come through a different door, all of those types of things. And so they're basically providing information in a one-way manner. And we weren't surprised by this, I don't think. I mean, I think the reason you can't really be surprised by this is that of the political system, courts are rightly so the most conservative in their sort of approach, right? And so while the open court principle is an important principle, the ability of people to like really truly participate in the legal system is quite minimal unless you are in a crime or in those types of situations. And so we think that this approach is very consistent to the way that we think courts work. Why we had the other types of tweets, and maybe so that would be the question of why would you look for the other things, was that there was a sense in the legal literature that the digital technologies could allow this to happen. And then we had this very strange outlier which was the Twitter feed of the Court of British Columbia. This feed is just fascinating for so many reasons. They were doing just about everything you could possibly. So they were engaging in conversations, they were retweeting, they were providing information. It was just all the things that we were looking for, they were engaging in. And, we had to talk to a few other people. We both live in Ontario about why we would think this. And someone had suggested that British Columbia has a sort of a bigger tradition of sort of public education than maybe the other provinces, and this might explain it. But that feed is just truly fascinating in the way that it engages with the legal community and citizens, which is so outside of the way that the traditional other courts really handled their social media.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the British Columbia case because it's, in a sense, to me, it highlights that within these different provinces in Canada, right, there isn't one overarching kind of rule book for how to use social media, even with a conservative institution like the court. So do you think that's something that's maybe a priority for the court itself? I know we're getting into speculative territory here, but or is it something that might have to do more with, as you said, that tradition of what British Columbia kind of values in its institutions, or some cultural aspect of that? Or what do you think kind of explains that outlier?
Yeah, so Professor Putterson and I sat and talked a lot about this. So one of the things that we don't like, this idea of what court administration looks like is not something that people spend a lot of time studying, right? And so where we might have a sense of what the communication structure looks like in a campaign, or a communication structure exists in the office of a member of parliament or a congressperson, what that might look like. We have no idea we can't even speculate about what this might look like, right? So who are the people who are tweeting? Like, is this the person who also makes the press releases? Is this a person who, this is just some weird thing that they've added onto their job? Like, oh, you do this in the courts for this court system, and would you mind also maintaining the Twitter feed? And so we actually really do wonder whether or not the BC thing, it could be sort of a broader sort of approach, or is it just that they have a really interesting person who's the person behind this feed, and people above it who don't freak out about the way that this person engages with it, right? And so so we're not really sure, right? Like, and so one of the things that, and I don't know if we'll ever get to this, would be to do interviews. I think interviews would be the way to get at it, because I think that we just actually don't understand, not even sort of from a digital technology perspective, but from a court perspective, how courts engage in political communication. And because we don't have that other side, we can't actually, it's really hard to speculate where digital technologies fit into it, where, as I said, like with campaigns or within the digital government, we have a better sense about what the history of communication looked like, how people behave, what the structure is. And we just have no sense of what that might look like. And again, if you have just some person who, as part of their regular job for working for the Superior Court of Ontario, they've been asked to maintain the Twitter feed. Yeah, you could see why, maybe once a day they're like, oh, I should get on there and like tweet out like that we're open tomorrow. And then that's the end of their job. Like that's the end of it.
Yeah, because it makes me also think, thinking about different branches of government, like what is the incentive really for the courts? If you're in the executive or legislative branch, you have some incentive to build support for your next election, or get some support around a policy proposal that you're trying to sort of complete. Whereas apart from kind of a pure value-driven, principle of the open court, I'm trying to think what actually would be the incentive for a court to invest in social media resources.
I think it's absolutely true. And again, we started with the live tweeting paper, and then we decided to move sort of more around the court system, because again, no one had been doing this kind of research in the country. But I think you're absolutely right. I think incentives, create a lot of and I think we've talked about this throughout this discussion. What kind of incentives is there for Canadian politicians to, be nasty on Twitter? Not a lot. And I think the same is true. And again, I think that when you see if you ever have a chance to look at the websites of Canadian courts, I think that that's also the case. The idea that no one is going to this website of of the Court of Nunavut, and so we're not going to spend tons and tons of dollars. But what we also found interesting about all of this, and again, I think that this is sort of filters into the idea comparing to the United States, is that Canada has never had a strong, we didn't move into the broadcast era of courts. So we sort of went from, pen and paper to the digital age, and it's a little sketchy. But I think you're absolutely right. And we saw, like many places had during the pandemic, is that, but I think there was a consequence to this, was that I think of many institutions, the Canadian courts were completely unprepared to use technology when the pandemic happened. Like, because they had been so reticent about technology and sort of, in their pen and paper world, I think that they were further behind the eight ball than other institutions. And if you look at the United States and the way courts have sort of moved trials online, Canadian courts for months were just like, well, we're just going to shut down. That's it. That was the response. And then only recent, like, I mean, I think the Supreme Court was like, there was several months the Supreme Court was like, well, we don't know what to do. Okay, that's it. And they're like, well, that's not really a thing. And so, they've slowly moved back on, but I think that other institutions were way easier to be able to adapt technology because they had been thinking about technology in other components that the courts had not.
Right. And you've written about this as well. And looking at how Canadian courses have adapted to COVID. And I mean, I think one of the things I was thinking about when reading your papers, it's not just that, okay, the courts are slow to adapt and they shut down. This has real implications for people who are awaiting trial. So what are some of those negative implications of this slowness to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, backlog is, I think Canada already had a backlog problem in our judicial system. This has only made it worse. And this is made even more problematic by the idea that, as we all know, that prisons are basically places where there's been huge outbreaks. Because you have a lot of people in small spaces without great ventilation. And so the idea that you're keeping more people in prisons because the system is not able to get people through means that it's not just a delay of justice, which is problematic. It's also, there's health risks to people. And so this is a real concern. But what we also found super interesting, and we did our analysis very early into the pandemic. So that, so this would, I think the paper came out in May. And so we looked at the court's first response to COVID in those first early months. But what we found really interesting was the idea that courts that didn't have to worry about things like, getting prisoners to, online, all of these things. So appellate courts, the Supreme Court, they also had no idea what to do. And so they had shut down too. And so these are courts that don't have witnesses, don't have defendants in the same sort of way. They were sort of out of the game for periods of time as well. I think we're starting to see courts ramp up, making use of technology. But at the time that we were studying this, and again, this was very early in the pandemic, American courts were like doing stuff. And I think partly because technology was a part of what they did already. And so they were just more prepared to engage with the use of technology in a way that I think Canadian courts really just had no clue about for a very long time.
Yeah, and if you even look at the savviness of American lawyers, they're adopting Zoom filters now in the form of cats.
I said to my colleague, I was so sad that didn't happen before a paper came out because we would have had a different title. Like, for sure.
I'm not a cat, sir. Oh, man. So wrapping up here and going back to an argument that you make in the book we discussed earlier, Digital Politics in Canada, it seems that from parties to citizens to courts, social media really hasn't, fundamentally revolutionized Canadian politics. And we see that argument being made in other contexts as well. Like, for example, in Germany, we talked about recently on the podcast. But in your view, where has social media had the greatest impact on Canadian politics? And where do you think it might play a potentially larger role in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't revolutionized it, but it is like ever present. Politicians, governments, they're expected to do these things, and they've all sort of adapted in the ways that they have. And I think, as you rightly point out, how far they go and how adventurous they are, I think is dependent on how they perceive the incentives to do so. I mean, I think the most interesting areas, I think, would be sort of social movements, which we see elsewhere, right? I think the work in our book by Lalancent and Renon that talk about the use of digital technologies by the Maple Spring, I Don't Know More, and then more recently, like, Canadian versions of Black Lives Matter and Me Too, I think have played an important role. We've also seen, Indigenous Canadians make effective use of technology, which has been really important. And I think the article by Antoine in the book makes that case. And I think also the article by Samantha Thrift that talks about digital feminism, I think that's another area. So I guess to the point, in the book, we make a distinction between sort of institutions and digital citizenship. The more interesting uses tend to be in the citizenship section. The more sort of, yes, we make use of technology, but blah, 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 tend to be in the institutions. So parties, governments, the sort of lack of movement on internet voting. I think we sort of see that very much in as sort of, normalization, or just sort of like people using it. It's important, but it's not sort of revolutionizing. But I think in those other areas, you start to see some really interesting uses. But I think that that's because it's driven by citizens and their need to participate in the political system.
Mm. Yeah, and that citizen focus is often underexplored. So, Dr. Small, thanks so much for coming on the show and giving us a bit of context into a context we haven't studied on the show, which is Canada, and also a branch of government we haven't looked at, which is courts.
Thank you much. It's been my great pleasure.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Tamara Small, Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Guelph. Her latest book is entitled Digital Politics in Canada, Promises and Realities, and you'll find a link to all the studies we discussed down in the show notes. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hold tight, as it may be a few weeks till our next episode drops. It's a busy time in the academic calendar, but I can say that in March we'll have one of, if not the world's leading sociologists on the podcast to talk about political performance and social media. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elna. See you next time.